Tonight, on History So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature an interview with an extraordinary filmmaker and author who's best known for his book on the American monetary system, which ranks in the top 50 nonfiction books on Amazon. G. Edward Griffin will share his wisdom and summarize his experience from more than 40 years of research, focusing on the struggle of the individual versus the collective. We'll discover how to identify tyranny and how to enact individual liberty. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up on History So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History So It Doesn't Repeat. I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and tonight we're going to connect with researcher, author, and filmmaker G. Edward Griffin, where we'll define freedom, observe the problems in our world, and we'll analyze our way forward to identify the contradictions in the history we've been taught, and learn how to outgrow the habit of outsourcing our minds by learning how to think clearly for ourselves. G. Edward Griffin is well known for his historical research, which culminated in the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, for his documentary film on the monetary system, The Capitalist Conspiracy, and for his groundbreaking 1968 presentation, The Grand Design for World Government. Like our prior guest, John Rappaport, you can find G. Edward Griffin in the upcoming feature documentary film, State of Mind, The Psychology of Control, and most days you can find him hard at work at his online stronghold at realityzone.com and freedomforceinternational.org. But right now we've got him live in person via the magic of Skype. Mr. Griffin, what does freedom mean to you?
It's a very good question, isn't it? Because a lot of people don't have any concept at all of what freedom is. They think that freedom is like not being in jail, and that's about it. But to me, it takes on kind of a philosophical note, because I think freedom is properly defined as the ability or the freedom to do whatever you want to do, provided, and there's of course the limitation, all freedoms have a natural limitation to them, provided you do not endanger the life, liberty, or property of another person. It's a very simple definition. And the more you think about it and the more you analyze how that plays out in different real life scenarios, I think the more you realize that this is a good definition. I've settled on this some years ago, and I've had no reason since that point to alter it. Well, I might add that the reason I call this a philosophical issue is because philosophically I believe that the only justification for the use of coercion, whether private force or through the state, the only moral justification for using coercion against another person, physical force, even to the extent of taking their lives, is to defend your life, your liberty, and your property. And therefore, if you're going to limit somebody else's freedom, you're going to use coercion, aren't you, to do that? And so we come to the same topic from the other side. In other words, you must not use coercion against a person unless it's to prevent that person from endangering the life, liberty, or property of another person.
Well, for those who don't recognize that the use of force, fraud, and coercion is a sign of intellectual bankruptcy, let's dig a little bit further into the philosophical terms of existence. When in your consciousness did you become aware of the war, it's the war that's waged on people who are creative and intuitive and inventive, and it's waged by the people who seek to suppress that consciousness?
I don't know when I became really aware of it. It's one of those things, I suppose, that it creeps up on you. You become a little bit aware of it, and then more as you go. I began to become aware of this sort of thing back in the 1960s, early 1960s. My first exposure to it at all was actually in 1959. I remember that date because I was working for a company, and it led me to the offices of one of my clients, and I was sitting there waiting for the appointment, and I stumbled across a magazine on the table in the waiting room. It's called The Free Man. It was published by the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington-on-Hudson in New York. And I was sitting there, and I read this little article, a very simple little article, advocating some fundamental principles of laissez-faire and free enterprise. And I thought, wow, I'd never read anything like this before. I just came out of school not too long before that. I'd gotten good grades in all my classes. I read a few books, but I never read anything like that in that silly little magazine. And so I remembered the date. I remembered the occasion. That was the beginning of a long journey.
Why have you spent so many decades of your life researching history, and how do you find it relevant to people today?
Well, the question why, I suppose, is the harder one. I don't know why. It's this, I think certain of us have a crusader instinct more than others. I think some people are more practical than others, and others are more idealistic than others. And I'm probably in that latter category. A lot of people are. And if you're idealistic and you want to see things right, and it's not in terms of just how do you benefit yourself, or how do you make money, or how you are looking good to your friends and your opponents, all those things. If you're concerned about things outside of your skin, what is the way the world should be? How should people relate to each other? And so, if you're that kind of a person, well, then you're helpless. I mean, you can't help yourself when you see an issue like we're talking about here. You're drawn to it. I mean, you're just absolutely drawn to it. And so I can't tell you why. I guess it's just because it's programmed into me. But the second part of your question, how does this relate? What's the relevance today? Well, I think today's headlines answer that question. I've noticed for years that most of the news that makes it into the mainstream media is bad news, isn't it? I mean, they don't spend a lot of time telling you about how well things are going. Most of the stuff you read about are how bad things are going, things that went wrong, something bad that someone did, an evil event or a catastrophe of some kind. I've noticed lately that this is accelerating, and it's so depressing to read the news and be aware of the news today. And why is that? It's because things aren't the way they should be. We were talking a moment ago, how would we change the world if we could? Well, if we could change the world the way we would like to, we wouldn't be reading all this bad news. So that's why it's relevant, because it means that we who feel this impulse to make a better life for our fellow men and for the future generations, we're not doing our job yet. We better get going. And so that's why it's relevant. I have this great feeling of urgency that, come on, Edward, let's go. You've only spent so many hours today. Don't give up. You've got a few more hours left. Get back to work. So I think that's the relevance.
Well, you do have an incredible output of media, articles, interviews. You keep a very busy schedule, which inspires me to do the same. So you're observing philosophically that something exists, we're conscious of it, and things are what they are, which is why we need to learn history. We can't just think these changes into action. It has to go from our imagination into physical reality through our actions, and using reason helps us make better decisions when we're taking those actions. So to bring it back to what you started out talking about, you're reading this alternative magazine called The Freeman. You see this article. It creates a little cognitive dissonance.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome so many of you into my home. Not only those of you who actually are here, but also those of you who are here indirectly through the medium of motion picture film. Now, as you know, the title of this presentation is The Grand Design. But I should explain at the outset that the real subject behind this title is U.S. foreign policy. Now, I realize that there are some who might think that I was trying to be funny or sarcastic with that statement, because for a long time there's been a generally accepted view that our foreign policy has been so bungled and confused that it couldn't possibly have followed any design, much less a grand one. But ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this presentation is to show not only that there is a grand design, but that it has been the consistent, dominant force behind absolutely every major move by the United States in the foreign policy field since at least the end of World War II. This grand design has provided the motivation for all we have done in the past, and unless some basic changes are made, it will determine everything we shall do in the future. Now, regardless of one's opinion of this grand design, it's the outgrowth of a powerful and compelling argument, a profound statement of philosophy, and a deceptively attractive appeal to reason. And ladies and gentlemen, unless we are able to counter this argument and to offer a superior philosophy, we'll continue to be like putty in the hands of its advocates. So it's important, to say the least, for us to understand what the grand design is, to analyze it in order to discover its flaws, if any, and then to offer a superior alternative if we can. These three requirements, then, will constitute the general outline of the material and the ideas to be presented here. First, identification. Second, analysis. And third, solution.
In 1968, you gave a presentation called The Grand Design for World Government. What happened between reading the article and your 1968 presentation, which I must say, I found to be very impressive because I only found it a couple years ago. I'd already read your books and I said, wow, this cat was talking about this stuff in 1968 and you did it right. You did it that was a very smooth presentation, simplified, yet not deleting anything that was necessary to communicate what was really going on. So I guess my question is, how do you predict the future?
Well, I think the answer to how you predict the future is something that you already talked about, knowing the past. Why is history important? History is important so that you can predict the future. If you don't know where you came from, you may know where you are today, but if you don't know where you came from, you have no direction. You can't draw a straight line yet until you have 2 points. So if people are just concerned about what's happening today, they don't know where they're headed yet. But if you can look back and see where you were 10 years ago or 100 years ago, now you can mentally lay a ruler down there and say, okay, this is where we were, this is where we are. You don't have to be a genius to project a straight line out. You can say without fear of contradiction that unless there are some major changes to change the direction in which we're heading, we're going to get to where we're headed, in other words. And so predicting the future is simply a matter of knowing where we were and being very coldly objective in terms of where we are today. Then the rest of it is real easy. I'll give you an example. If we look back 100 years, for example, and we can make a formula and say, well, how much government did we have? How much control over our lives did we have 100 years ago? Now, I know you can't quantize this exactly, but let's just say, let's say about maybe 15% of our lives were dominated by government directives and decrees, rules and regulations, limitations, all this stuff. Well, okay, where is it today? Well, how do you measure it? I would guess, and I think most people would agree, that we're well over 50%. We might argue whether it's 70 or 80% or whatever, but we're well over 50%, which is good enough for our straight line projection. If we continue to go as we have been going without any major changes, the percentage of government control over our lives will be 100%. It's just a question as to how long it will take. But that's where we're headed. So I can predict the future. I can honestly say that unless there are some major changes in the thinking of the American people as to what is the proper function of the state and what is the way we want to live in a society, unless that is changed, we are going to wind up living under totalitarianism.
Is this a limited and local totalitarianism just to the United States? Or is it some form of proposed world government? And if so, how would you juxtapose it to the ideas of nationhood in America in its origins?
Well, what I'm talking about is the phenomenon that is definitely visible in the United States. But when you travel around the world, I'm not a great world traveler, but I've done enough of it to see that it's everywhere I've been. I used to think that, boy, I want to go to Australia. I think Australia, now those people are really, they all live in the outback, right? And they wear those funny hats and they're individualists and they do what they want to do. It's like America used to be. Well, I found out when I went, I've been there a couple of times, and there's some semblance of that, of course, but it's mostly personality and it's tradition. But what's happened in Australia and New Zealand, which I thought would even be more independent, why, those people are further ahead of us on this scale toward totalitarian government. I was totally shocked to see that. I've been to England. Of course, they're the granddaddies of it all. I expected them to be ahead of us, and they are. I've been to France. They're ahead of us. Everywhere I have been, at least, the world is going in the same direction because the driving engine of this is a philosophy. It's an idea. I call it the idea X. It's infected the world. And that idea X really has a name. It's called collectivism. The whole world has bought into this concept of collectivism. They think that's the way it should be. We should have this all-powerful state. Individual is not important. If we put individual rights ahead of the group, well, that makes it selfish, right? That's the thinking of it. Therefore, the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. And all of that stuff that we learn in school and read in our textbooks. The whole world has been infected with this idea. So therefore, as long as people think that's the way it should be, they will vote for candidates to public office who will implement that idea. Every candidate, almost every candidate, with very few exceptions, that the masses rush to support and send into office, what do they promise to get those votes? We will make government bigger. We will take care of this problem. We will have more power to solve this problem. We're going to provide education and health care, housing and vacations and whatever you want. And a few things you don't want. We're going to provide it through this instrument called the state. And people say, yeah, that's good. And so they vote for these guys, and that's what they get. So therefore, I'd say the whole world is infected with this idea X called collectivism, and that's the reason where the whole world is heading toward totalitarianism.
I guess the natural question then would be, if somebody is redefining what it means to be an American, and they're using this philosophy, call it collectivism, who might be behind this? Through history, could you cite some cases so that people in the audience who might think that this is kind of conspiratorial, we're actually talking about some deep history here, and I'd like to maybe flesh out some of the characters.
Well, this is a can of worms because I think there are two forces at work here. One is a natural force and one is a conspiratorial force. Of course, you might argue that conspiracies are a natural force, which in a way I think they are, because if you do look at history, conspiracies are the engine of history. Almost every event, major event that ever occurred in history happened not because of some kind of a spontaneous rising of the masses or some spontaneous falling of a boulder that happened to hit somebody over the head. No, these were planned, and usually they were planned in secret, and everybody should know that. Anybody that scoffs at the idea of conspiracy, I feel sorry for them because it tells me they have never read a history book. Histories are everywhere. And even today, you can't go into any courthouse, even in your local community, and sit there and listen to these cases being tried for very long until finally, before the end of the day, there have been a couple of cases on conspiracy to do this, conspiracy to do that, conspiracy to deprive the customer, conspiracy to break the contract, conspiracies abound. So anyway, is that a natural force or is that an unnatural force? I don't know. I don't get. Either way, it's a reality. On the other hand, there are natural forces there that are at work. And it follows with this idea X. You see, if you believe that the proper function of the state is to solve all problems, then you have to give the state the power to solve those problems. They need the tools. They need the money. They need the taxes. They also need the power to use coercion against people to force them to do what the state says. Well, everyone has heard the old saying from Lord Acton that power corrupts. And he went on to say, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's a truism. I think any child in grade school could see that. So what we have done when we set up the state as the all-powerful entity to solve all problems, and we keep making it more powerful and more powerful and more powerful, what we have unintentionally endorsed is that we are saying, okay, we're going to corrupt everybody that goes into government because we've made the corruption so tempting. In other words, governments, especially powerful governments, are magnets. They're magnets, and they draw to them the predator class. All of the would-be criminals are really drawn to government because they can see here in government with all this power, they can legally do what previously it would have been illegal to do. But once they're on the inside of the mechanism that decides what is legal and what is illegal, now they're protected. They're insulated from punishment. So this is the natural force I'm talking about. If we, in our stupidity, think that an all-powerful government is a good thing, then what we have done is endorse the creation of a magnet that's going to draw into government every crook and criminal within 1,000 miles. They're going to gravitate into government, and we are going to get what we deserve. Is this a conspiracy? No. It's a natural tendency, I think, in human psychology. People love to dominate other people. Well, not everybody likes to, of course, but there's enough that do. All you need is a couple with a machine gun or finger on a red button for an atomic bomb. You don't need lots of people if you've got the maniacs in control with the ability to use coercion.
Well, you've identified this predatory class. You've mentioned reading good history books. Since seeing some of your presentations over the years and your incredible bookshelf behind you, I've developed a few bookshelves of my own. I have an entire bookcase of books by the Rothschild family. Their memoirs, their autobiographies, biographies, these credible history books that laid out this empire that was affecting governments during the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and 21st century. And it was completely off my radar. I had graduated from college. I had worked on Wall Street in New York. I had never heard of them. I thought they weren't real until I went to a Barnes & Noble and I saw the Niall Ferguson 2-volume set. And I was like, well, this is real enough to dig into here. And it's led me to, 20, 30, or 40 of these books on the specific financial empire. Could you describe maybe the role of the Rothschild empire in the creation of Cecil Rhodes and what his legacy is in the world?
Well, it sounds to me like I ought to be asking you to do that. You've read all these books. I have not read the series that you talked about, but I do know enough, I think. I know enough about the Rothschilds to know how important a role they played in the development of the banking model that exists in the world today, called central banking. They were really the originators, as you know, of this whole concept. And I think it's verified that the first real important implementation of that was the Bank of England, with the Rothschilds as the driving force behind it.
For example, in 1694, international banker William Patterson obtained the charter of the Bank of England, and the power over England's money system fell into private hands. In a boastful mood, Patterson said, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing." 230 years later, Reginald Mackina, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, "The banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." Turning to the United States, Dr. Quigley tells us, "The structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business in the period 1880 to 1933 was of extraordinary complexity, one business fief being built on another, both being allied with semi-independent associates, the whole rearing upward into two pinnacles of economic and financial power. One, centered in New York, was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company, and the other, in Ohio, was headed by the Rockefeller family. When these two cooperated, as they generally did, they could influence the economic life of the country to a large degree and could almost control its political life, at least on the federal level. In the United States, it was inevitable that the international banking interests would attempt to establish the same kind of private monopoly over the money system that they had achieved in England, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. The same formula would be used: make it look like a government operation, but keep the control in private hands.
But the question that you ask is, what is this formula? What is this this mechanism? Well, I think that I called it the Rothschild formula in my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I tried to make it very clear that I didn't really believe that at any point in history, any member of the Rothschild family actually sat down with one of their children or grandchildren and said, "Come, let me talk to you, son. This is how it works." That's not what happened. But nevertheless, there are, as I could see just reading these books and standing on the outside looking in, I figured that it had to be something like this. It became obvious through the years as this family dynasty perfected these techniques and learned these lessons as they were on the front lines, the financial front lines with their competitors. There were certain lessons that came up out of that. And so I tried to make a list of these lessons, and I won't go into all of them, but basically the idea was this. They must have realized at some point that wars are terrible. Nobody likes wars. Okay. But wars are perpetual. Everywhere you look, there are wars. We will never stop wars because human nature is such that wars are part of the competitive instincts and the greed and the so even though we hate wars, wars are here to stay. Okay. Next. The next thing, so what do we do about it? If we can't stop the wars, maybe we can benefit from them in some way. How can we do that? When you follow this type of reasoning, totally objective, totally cold, no emotion, no morality involved. Just what do we do, realistically speaking? As pragmatic, practical men, what do we do? Well, the next step was to determine that wars are expensive. And governments, even in those days, governments or the royalties were always out of money. I mean, the only way they got their money primarily was to go conquer somebody that had some and steal their money, and of course to tax the peasants, but that was not very productive because there wasn't a lot of wealth anywhere except in the coffers of the royalty. So the main way of getting money was to go conquer somebody and go kill somebody and steal what they had. And but that took money because you had to pay the soldiers and you had to buy the armaments. And so the part of the formula was, well, governments need money to wage wars to be successful. We will lend them the money since that's our business. We have the money. In those days, money was gold or silver. That was money. And any of those paper things, the banknotes, were not considered really as valuable money. They were greatly discounted, if accepted at all. And so they were the goldsmiths, and they had the money, and they would loan the money to governments at any interest rate. It didn't make any difference because it made no difference. If you're going to conquer somebody, you got all the money you want. You got all their money anyway. It didn't make any difference what the interest rate was. Your goal was to conquer or to avoid being conquered. This primal act of survival, nobody asks what it costs. So they had that figured out. And I'm perhaps taking too long with this, but finally, by the time this plays out, the idea is we will lend money to governments. And the issue comes up, well, what happens if after the king that you loaned all this money to, he wins the war and he doesn't pay you back? What do you do now? No problem, son. We give money to his opponent who wages war against him, and he goes in and kills him. And now now it's the other nation that owes us the money. And so part of the Rothschild formula, and it's not just the Rothschilds involved in this is a class of people throughout history, figured out that it was wise to finance both sides of a war. That way you had control. And the monarchs knew that if they failed to pay back, the financiers would finance their enemies and their kingdom would be overrun. They always paid back their loans for that reason because they feared the consequences. And so this goes on, and this is how this whole banking system evolved because it's based on the profits from war. And we can see it. Once you understand it, you can see it at work even today. Nobody asks what these weapon systems cost. It doesn't make any difference. We're going to get it from the people somehow. Now, of course, they don't have to get it just from the coffers of the empires they overthrow. They get it from their people. They get it through taxation, and primarily they get it through that hidden taxation called inflation. Perhaps we'll come to that issue in a moment, but it's a form of taxation. It comes eventually from the people themselves. So what is the Rothschild formula? The model is that be totally objective, be totally unemotional about it. There's no merit in one side versus the other. It doesn't make any. They're all a bunch of evil people. Who can choose sides between two evil sides? We'll finance one side or the other. Doesn't make any difference as long as we make the money and we are in control. And somewhere down the path throughout all of this, the financiers become the controllers of the governments. And it was Rothschild, as you know, is quoted as saying, "Give me the power to make a nation's money, and I care not who passes its laws." And that's just as true today as ever before. If you can create the money, you can hire the people who pass the laws. That's it.
Well, and then they found out they could buy off the press, and then they found out they could send a guy to South Africa like Cecil Rhodes to fight in the Boer War, to take the diamonds and gold, to create apartheid and concentration camps. And then they discovered that they could take that system and kind of take it worldwide. Can you talk a little bit about the legacy of the Last Will and Testament of Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Scholars?
Yeah, that's a huge topic, isn't it? And we can't do justice to it here, but I think people need to know. We're back to this topic of a conspiracy again. One of the greatest conspiracies of all history was created by Cecil Rhodes. Of course, he didn't call it a conspiracy. He called it a secret society. Well, if a secret society weren't secret, there'd be no point in having a society like that unless it was secret. And why is it secret? It's because they have things they want to conceal. So it is almost by definition a conspiracy. Anyway, a lot of people didn't know that. I didn't know this when I first became aware of William Stead's writings of the Last Will and Testament of Cecil Rhodes. Stead was the administrator of the estate and all of that. My eyes were popping out. I couldn't believe this. And of course, the writings of Carroll Quigley, the professor of history from Georgetown University, who was Bill Clinton's mentor, and all of these things came together. And in fact, I see on my vision of your desktop there on your right, the word hope is sticking there. That's the last part of Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, and I think that's what your whole series is about. So you know better than most people how important Quigley's research and work was. The bottom line is that Quigley wrote about the most successful secret society, I believe, of history, and it didn't have a name. They were smart enough not to give it a name. Even Quigley himself didn't know what to call it. He called it the group sometimes. Other times he called it the Rhodes movement or the boys or different names for it. I decided that I would have to give it a name so I could talk about it. I call it the Rhodesians or the Rhodesians. Actually, it would be a better way to call it the Rhodesians. And that's just my name for it. But the point is, for your listeners, is that Cecil Rhodes devoted almost all of his vast wealth to the creation of a secret society. And the purpose of this secret society was to conquer the world, literally, using certain techniques that would not be visible to the common man. They would create the movement and populate it with very intelligent, very powerful, and in the beginning, very wealthy people, although that has changed somewhat. In the beginning, you had to be wealthy to get into it. Now you get into it and then get wealthy. It's a little bit different. But very powerful people who are highly placed in all of the power centers of society. By that, I mean political parties, in the media, labor unions, church organizations, all of the power centers that the people follow. They follow their leaders in certain groups. And it's the culmination of the influence of these power centers that determine the policy of a nation. So if you want to control a nation, you don't have to come out and say, I got 51% of the votes. All you have to do is just control the leaders of these organizations. And if you can do that using money, blackmail, education, influence, ideology is a very powerful motivator to control people. All you need is about 0.1% of the population. If they're in the leadership positions of these power centers, you control the whole society. And this was the formula that came up, that Cecil Rhodes devised. And the group was designed to do exactly that. And Quigley wrote about it. People need to read about the tactics they used. And this is what is running the world today.
Well, and it also occurs that Rhodes is taking, or Andrew Carnegie's taking from Rhodes, these internationalists, the Rockefeller family. And so after Rhodes' last will and testament, you have these families getting together in a Pilgrim Society. And then a couple years later, Federal Reserve, IRS, CFR. And when you follow who created these things, it all comes back to the same cadre of people that you describe in your book. You describe so eloquently in your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Can you talk about that group of people, their mentality, and what their needs are, what drives them as a human motivation as opposed to the individual, and see if we can bridge this gap?
Yes, and I will do this with great timidity because I don't offer myself as a psychologist. It's not my role to determine how people think or what motivates them. I would probably be wrong in many cases. But I can sense that there are certain human instincts that we all share that must be active in this. For example, we see this in teenagers and young people. I went through it as a kid. We go to school and we learn a few things. And all of a sudden, we're the smartest things we think that ever walked the earth. I went to school, Mom and Dad. You don't know anything. I went to college. I know. I read some books. And what did you read? My teachers told me that you don't know anything. So there's this pride, this false pride that usually infects a young person when they begin to get a little bit of knowledge. And then they start thinking, well, I know so much, I ought to start making the decisions. And so I think what happens with a lot of people is they become, or they want to become, human engineers. Like you and like me, we want to see a better world. But they decide they just don't want to see it. They're going to make it. Well, we might decide we're going to make it too, but now this is where we part company. We may decide we're going to make it by convincing people that this is the better way to go. And they decide they're going to make it by forcing people to do it this way. Or they're going to use coercion. And they justify it in their mind because they figure this is the way life should be. And I know this is true of Cecil Rhodes because he actually wrote about it in his memoirs. And there was one piece, I think I might have put it in the book, where he said, we British are very fortunate. We've inherited the greatest culture in the world. We have the greatest level of education, the highest standard of living. And we owe it to the rest of these poor, ignorant slobs. He didn't use that word, but you could just hear that's what he was thinking in between the lines. We owe it to the rest of these ignorant peasants around the world to run their lives for them, because if we don't tell them what to do, they were going to make the wrong choices. So we have an obligation to be their rulers for their own good. Okay, this is part of the mindset. And I can see that in a lot of these leaders around the world. You can just tell by looking at their faces. They're so filled with their importance and their righteousness, even though what they're doing is ruining the lives of millions of people and sometimes taking the lives of millions of people in some war effort. Still, in their minds, I'm sure they're justified to think, I'm doing this because it's the best thing for society, and in the future, our children and our grandchildren are going to sing our praises. I think that's the basic mindset of these people. Now, does that mean there aren't other motives? Oh, no. There are plenty of motives, because I think by the time you get into this mechanism of world power, you begin to realize that, hey, this is a nice life that I'm leading. I get to fly everywhere in the world in a private jet. I've got all the money I can use. If I get into trouble with the law, nobody dares touch me. I'm untouchable. Like my name is Kennedy or something like that. I can do anything and nothing will ever happen to me. So I'm sure there's a heady wine there that comes with that power that is not at the same level of this idealism. So I'm going to say maybe those two factors are at work.
I would think that's an accurate answer. It's an honest answer, because I can't even imagine not hearing the word no, because you have so much money that everyone around you will just do whatever you say because they want the thing that you have already, right? So it's such an interesting mechanism of control over human beings, the study of currency, the study of money. And I want to confluence the study of currency and money in with education now by referring to, I can't even attach words to what I felt when I first saw your interview with Norman Dodd.
The story you are about to hear represents a missing piece in the puzzle of modern history. Without this knowledge, many contemporary events are simply beyond understanding. You are about to hear a man tell you that the major tax-exempt foundations of this land, since at least 1945, have been operating to promote a hidden agenda. And that agenda has nothing to do with the surface appearance of charity, good works, or philanthropy. This man will tell you that the real objectives include the creation of a worldwide collectivist state, including the Soviet Union, which is to be ruled from behind the scenes by those same interests which now control the tax-exempt foundations.
That what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I, of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, "Well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you've told me? And his answer was, we would not think of doing any such thing. So then I said, well, Mr. Gaither, obviously you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you've just told me.
Mr. Dodd, you have spoken before about some interesting things that were discovered by Catherine Casey at the Carnegie Endowment. Can you tell us that story, please?
She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, we are, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in the an alteration in the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency.
I think you did in 1981, because I got what he was saying and I was like, wow, this is all unraveling right here, and it's the Carnegie. I mean, it brought a lot of validity to things that I had heard as a conspiratorial rumor and the internet and things like this. On the internet, things like that seem to be far off, but you were able to bring it close to home by putting a whistleblower on film, by making a piece of media that, you know, made its way through time, and years later people are starting to realize what you realized back then. How did you come to get that interview on film, and what do you think its legacy has been thus far?
Well, it was an accident that I got Norman Dodd on film. I had read his testimony in some obscure government publication, little pamphlet, and it was an electrifying testimony, as you know. And I thought, boy, I wish more people would read this or know about it. So anyway, make a long story short, I made a mental note of where he lived. It was in Virginia. And it just so happened that a few months later, I was making a very low-budget documentary film, and I had to be in Virginia with a camera crew. So we did our interviews for that day, and it was coming up on the weekend. And I had these guys there, and I said, do you want to work over the weekend? And they said, yeah, why not? Why not? We're here. So I thought, maybe I'll try and see if I can contact this guy called Norman Dodd. I had no way to contact him. Anyway, I knew he lived in the area. I went in the telephone directory and looked it up, Norman Dodd. I think there were 3 of them, and I took the first one. Hello, is this Mr. Norman Dodd from the chief investigator for the Reese Committee? He said, yes, that's me. I couldn't believe that. I just almost fell off the chair. It was first try. That happened again in another situation some years later. But anyway, just stroke of genius. I said, well, Mr. Dodd, I'm very happy to talk to you. I've read your testimony, and I'm here doing some filming for a documentary. could we have some of your time? Would you like to tell your story for our cameras? He says, yes, yeah, I'd like to do that. So that's how it came about. It was about as simple as falling off of a log. So we sent a cab over and picked him up. And as you know, he was quite advanced in years. And his eyesight was failing, but his brain was not failing at all. And he just sat there for a couple of hours and just spilled it all out. Everything he had done, everything, all of his experiences, what he learned, and his predictions for the future.
Well, his predictions for the future have been accurate, as have yours, because you understood the incremental steps being taken that would take decades for them to convert us from self-reliant, self-confident, people with self-esteem to dependent on authority, outsourcing our thinking, and create superficial anchors on the outside that we have to attain by using money instead of actually building experience and knowledge and finding that as a survival tool, which again comes full circle back to philosophy and the consistent and methodical application of philosophy to find out what exists and to discern the reality from the unreality that is so prominently purveyed out there by mainstream media.
Well, it might be good to mention, just for the sake of the record here, for those who are not familiar with Dodd, is that he was the chief investigator for a committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations. And this was right after World War II. And I didn't realize it at the time, but there were a lot of people who were deeply concerned over these tax-exempt foundations because why would they be concerned? Well, I found out from reading some of the editorials in the Hearst newspapers, for example, that the tax-exempt foundations were financing out-and-out communist propaganda. I mean, they were printing and distributing speeches by Joseph Stalin. All of the Marxist-Leninist ideology was being regurgitated by some of these major tax-exempt foundations, the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace, the Rockefeller Funds, and so forth. And so people were saying, what's going on here? And they wanted an investigation. And that's why the committee was formed, and Norman Dodd was named as the chief investigator. So he tells the story of traveling that road of investigation and how frank the heads of these foundations were in telling him what they were doing. And just to keep it short, the head of the Carnegie Fund, or the Ford Foundation rather, not the Carnegie, the Ford Foundation said, Mr. Dodd, he said, I'll tell you what we're doing here, is that we're doing everything we can to change life in the United States so it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And Dodd says he almost fell off of his chair when he heard that. Of course, we realize now, putting that in context, it wasn't the Soviet Union per se. What he was talking about is that they wanted to create a world government which could embrace the United States and the Soviet Union, which were at opposite ends, you would think, of the political spectrum. So if you could get those two together, you get all the rest too, you say. So they were trying, he was really talking about creating a new world order, a world government, with an ideology that would include all nations of the world, including the United States and the Soviet Union. And then the rest of that story, Dodd discovered how they intended to do it, and they intended to do it through fear. Fear generated from wars. And these tax-exempt foundations decided that they should promote getting the United States into war, and more war, because under the hysteria of war, people will give up their cherished liberties, give up their ideas of their traditions, anything just to survive war. And so that is what we have seen implemented ever since.
So these people who are all over the world, you can call them the superclass, as David Rothkopf did in his book. He's a CFR and Carnegie Endowment member. So when he says there's 6,000 individuals on the planet who act as a superclass that have rights above you, I mean, these people, what ties them together is a collectivist philosophy. The fact that they may have goals and ideas, but they're not willing to stop at, certain limitations of morals or ethics because they don't have the same values that we do. So what you're describing is a predatory class. I think a technical name would be interest-specific kleptoparasites, because they are of the same species and they steal from us. They plunder and destroy instead of create. And that seems to be how they exist. So tying it all together now, over your 40 years plus of research and observation of this situation, we have the existing reality is that our education system has been dismantled by this group. They are messing with genetics and eugenics and messing with our food and our air and our water. We seem to be being attacked as a human species on all of our basis of our needs. And I just can't help to think that that's not coincidental. And in reading books like yours, you come to find that these things have a lot of substance to them. So what can an individual do besides listening or watching this interview? What can they do after this interview to continue taking steps in the right direction so that they can become an individual again and not be so dependent on a collective mentality?
Well, I think that the approach is twofold. First of all, you have to get very clear in your own mind what is right and what is wrong, and where you want to be in this battle, because the battle lines are forming, and if you don't want to be destroyed in the middle, or being destroyed fighting on the wrong side. Being destroyed is bad enough, but if you're destroyed on the wrong side or caught in the middle, it's even worse, I would think. If you've got to get clear in your mind where you belong in this conflict. Once you do that, then you start thinking about strategies. Well, what's the best way to be victorious and to bring truth and justice as we see it into the victor's circle? And with that in mind, I created an organization in 2002 called Freedom Force International. And I won't go into it here, except it is an international organization. We have members in about 60 different countries now. They all have one thing in common. They understand that this is a battle, a life and death battle between individualism and collectivism. In all the different countries of the world, it may take little different forms. They may call them under different names and so forth. They may think they're fighting communism or fascism or Nazism or socialism or something else, but our people understand those are all the same. They're just variants of collectivism. And they also understand that the superior ideology is individualism. And they've said, that's the side we want to be on. And they also know then that the only way you can bring individualism back into dominant positions in public life is to move the collectivists out of their positions of power. Just wringing your hands and complaining about it isn't going to accomplish anything. We've got to replace those people with individualists who have this other point of view. How do you do that? That's what Freedom Force International is all about. The strategies and the tactics, they're moral, they're ethical tactics, but they all involve one thing, and that is you've got to get up off of your couch, you got to get out of your house, and you got to go out to where the people are and become active in and influential in organizations where people are accomplishing things. That's the underlying strategy. It's the strategy that our opponents used successfully to take over the world. And it's the only strategy that can be used to recapture it. So if anyone is interested in that, I urge them to come to our website. It's called freedomforceinternational.org. And be prepared to spend some very interesting evenings reading our materials.
Well, speaking of 100 ways to subvert collectivism every day, you keep very busy. You're always publishing. You're always keeping the newsletter every week from the Reality Zone is very informational, to say the least. What are you working on right now? Unfiltered news.
That takes a lot of my time every week, as you just said. But I'm trying to inch forward on my next book, which is more or less about what I've been describing here. The next book has a tentative title, and that's The Future is Calling. The subtitle describes it a little bit better. The subtitle is An Invitation to Change the World. Modest little challenge there, but that's what we intend to do. We will change the world.
Well, the future is calling, and this is your invitation to change the world. What idea could you express to the audience that you want to propagate through time?
One idea. Individualism is superior to collectivism. That's it. Once people really understand what that means, once they understand what is this thing, collectivism, and what is its constructive opposite, individualism, then 99% of all of the issues that perplex people today and worry people, they just disappear. They melt because you can see the underlying philosophy, the justice of your decisions based on a truth. And just what truth would that be? Well, you've got to read and find out, but I'll give you one little quickie. Collectivism believes that the group is more important than the individual. Individualists believe that that's nonsense because, first of all, there is no group. Group doesn't exist. Group is an idea. It's a mental concept. It's an abstraction. You can't touch a group. You can touch people, but not group. It's mathematical. So if you base your model of the state as being the assumption that the group is more important, the group which doesn't exist, is more important than individuals which do exist, you've made a terrible mistake because someone's going to come along, some leader, great leader said, I speak for the group. I speak for the majority. And you will do what I say because it's in the best interest of society. And if you disagree, into the ovens, sort of thing. It's the way it works. That's my idea I would like to leave out there. Figure out, first of all, what is this conflict between individualism and collectivism? And then the conclusion is individualism is superior to collectivism.
Mr. Griffin, it's been a pleasure. I think anyone watching this will have gotten a tremendous amount out of the first viewing and will be digging in for another viewing. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Richard, and good luck to you.
And with all that being said, if you'd like to know more, you can sign up for Mr. Griffin's email digest at realityzone.com, where you can also find his books, DVDs, and other productions which inspire cognitive liberty. Don't forget to stop by tragedyandhope.com, fly with us on Twitter to stay up to date on thought-provoking news, and download our podcast, The Peace Revolution. Reprioritize some of your time and fill your mind with useful knowledge. That's how you grow in the right direction. Tragedy and hope. It's like putting together a puzzle, and what you discover as a result is yourself. Until next time, thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.